Thank you. Inviting PM to open the round here.
Okay, hi. Before I start speaking, am I audible for everyone?
Yep, all good.
All right. POX through chat, I probably only take something around 5, 6. But yeah, please don't unmute yourself. All right. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. I think first thing to really understand specifically about East Asian countries, right, is how authoritarian we are in nature. And this is something that's been passed down because of these strongman leaders. So a couple of things just to clarify before I get into my arguments. We need to know what these strongman leaders look like and why we think glorification is so bad and what this glorification has done in terms of both how it affected people at the time as well as how it continues to affect us to this day. Right, so what are these strongman leaders? We think that these are like leaders who are kind of seen as the fathers of their nations, right? Because perhaps for a lot of them, if we're going to talk about Lee Kuan Yew, they kind of like created what the nation has become. And ultimately, because of the fact that they were seen as like a very public face, they were seen as the people who were like shaped what the country would ultimately do in the course of like their time as the leaders. We think what this means is that these people have become kind of like gods to their own countries, in the sense that people really worship their contributions and in the long run kind of look at them as perfect figures, despite like any shortcomings that they may have had, which I'll talk about a bit later. So what do we mean when we say that these people have been glorified, right? We think what this means is that by their political parties and by people at large, a lot of their flaws are basically ignored. Anything that they actually did by mistake, any errors that they may have made in their time as leaders is really overlooked, in the sense that these leaders are seen as godfathers to their nations. And that kind of just means that in the long run, we attribute the success of a nation entirely to them, right? We downplay their flaws, and in the long run, right, we can't question any of their choices, right? Because by being bold enough to try and question the decisions of these leaders, you are questioning the merit of your entire nation, right? Because these people created what the nation is. So by questioning any decisions that they had made then, or any decisions that their political parties make now, and I'll talk about why that's important later, but by questioning them, you question your entire nation. You are being, you're not being a patriot, you're not being a fair citizen. And obviously the kind of backlash that this gives people is very harmful. And obviously in some circumstances, in certain countries, talking against these kinds of leaders, these strong men, superhero-like figures, what you end up doing is you can get yourself put in jail for even questioning or trying to question anything about them, right? So I think one thing that Orbit's going to try and tell us and in their time they were very unifying and it was very important, blah, blah, blah. I think that what we need to talk about before Orb can even come up and tell us this is that understand that the reason why we think they were unifying is because the narrative has glorified them and glorified the way that they rallied people together, right? We are never going to be told about all the mistakes they made, all the people who felt left out by their movements. And that's the truth of it, right? The majority of these leaders did not unify their entire country behind them and make everyone feel good about being a developing country that's coming into a new whatever. We think the reality of it really is that these leaders left out large portions of people who were never really made to feel like they were part of the demographic that was part of the country in the first place. So here's the thing, right? I'll take you around 5. Understand that in order to even be able to question these leaders at that time, you weren't able to, and that's something that has continued to carry on to the present day as well, right? And this is why we think it's so detrimental that we regret this notion, right? Because we think we have to prefer a world where people can freely question and critique leaders, right? Because that's how you progress as a nation. You can't progress if you are not even able to question the people who are making policies in the first place. If you're not able to have any kind of meaningful discourse, you're not going to get to a point where your nation can thrive and improve and develop further than what this leader is able to envision from their limited viewpoint, right? So that's the real impact that we see in the present. We see that what this has caused is that the political parties, etc., that were tied to these people in the past are able to continue piggybacking off of their success, right? Which means that they're able to vilify and in a very, very toxic way, they're able to kind of out people who don't meet the same criteria, right? Because in the view of the people who are like buying into the glorification, what that means is that these people, these like citizens, are going to believe that that strongman leader is what the country needed, right? Because that's the like kind of brainwashing that we've been forced into, right? We've been forced into these authoritative regimes in East Asia, where we believe that these leaders did what they did because they had no other option, and that's largely untrue, right? They did this, they acted in whatever way because it was probably the easiest way to get to like a developed nation, right? It was easier to ice out certain parts of your population because a bigger population was able to like rally behind you, right? So the ideas that these people had in the past end up continuing to be very valid in today's day and age, which is like really just not a fair like criteria for majority of your population, right? Because understand that as the population progresses, there are going to be different like demographics that cannot continue to like buy into the ideas from 50 years ago, right? Because I understand that what these political parties continue to be able to do, and I'll take a POI now before 6.
Yeah, so the debate does not exist in a vacuum. Without glorifying these leaders on the government counterfactual, how would you portray these leaders, and would you glorify anyone else instead?
I think that's the problem, right? Why do you want to glorify anyone? We think the real way to portray these leaders is to portray them as they really were, right? Talk openly about their flaws. Talk about the fact that, yes, they may have made like leaps and strides for the country overall, but you cannot ignore everything that they did wrong. Because to this day, we still ignore the shortcomings that they had, and we assume that they are the perfect ideal of what a leader needs to be. That gives the political parties the excuse to be able to ice out any other like meaningful opposition, because these leaders are considered the ideal, right? So if an opposition member comes up and this person is very different from what the rest of like the political party, what the population believes is the ideal leader, you're able to say like, we're not going to like be able to adapt to the change because this is not what we need. We need the same kind of leader that we've been told is the ideal leader. The population needs to be informed, and people need to understand what their leaders have really been like, right? The idea of glorifying them to the point that they become godlike figures who cannot be questioned is the problem in status quo. That's why we need to regret this. We need to live in a society where we're able to question leaders freely, where we're able to see that not every leader is perfect, and in reality, no leader is perfect. When you put on these like rose-tinted glasses of seeing that all of these leaders who have built your nations are godfathers who you have to be like extremely grateful to, even if you don't know the extent of what they've done, we think that's a world that we have to regret. For all these reasons, very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, PM. Inviting LO.
Just to check, am I audible?
Yep, all good.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government easily loses the debate when they ignore the word benevolent within the motion. Because note, the whole case is contextualized on a malevolent strongman leader wanted to weaponize current conditions on the ground to solidify their rule for decades. I think this is unfair to the debate, given that the motion forces both teams to consider the aspect of benevolence within these leaders. With that being said, what exactly do we support on the side of opposition? First of all, a 5-pronged model. 1, we don't regret this glorification. We support the status quo. 2, we think that benevolent strongman leaders would exist on the opposition side. But then what matters is who exactly which side were we then able to create a cohesive society? Thirdly, what are characteristics of these benevolent strongman leader? Because I think government was very convenient and didn't give you any analysis. 3 things here. 1, because they're benevolent, it means they have the people's best interests at heart. 2, I think strongman leaders care about their image, and it means that they want to look good in the public eye. 3, I think as a result, it means that they're going to do things like consult technocrats in their process of making policies because they want to have good policies implemented. So it looks like focusing on things like inclusivity when you have multiple ethnicities because you want social cohesion. Or it looks like Kuan setting up multiple departments filled with technocrats so you can ensure the best policies will pass. 5thly, what does this glorification look like? Because I don't think government was very charitable with their characterization. Note that this is the image of an ideal leader, sure, but the only reason why we glorify glorified his leader's actions is because of the good actions that are done. So I think people are still able to separate the person from the action. Don't buy their whole blanket assertion. Finally then, what is the context? I'd like to note that because this is a retrospective debate, the proposition counterfactual takes place the moment we just got out of post-colonization. So they can't claim abstract benefits without actually mechanizing towards a path of change under their side. With that being said, 3 responses. 1, towards the whole setup, I think the whole case about glorification just ignores the aspect of benevolence, because benevolent leaders actually want to be celebrated for their actions. So any bad thing they do, they will want to resolve. They don't ignore it and let it snowball, because that comes at the cost of the people they care about so much. I like to note here that people like Lee Kuan Yew actively actually discourage a toxic personality cult forming around him, because he recognized the implications of it for Singapore's political rule in the future, which is why in the instances of benevolent leaders, I think they don't want these sort of things to come about. Thirdly then, I actually have no idea what their counterfactual is, because if they just want to have this abstract notion of people just calling out leaders as and when they want, no, they don't have fiat to say you can have objective criticism, because what you do on the side of government is you let every Tom, Dick and Harry criticize any leader who comes into power. I think what you do is you enable the political dissidents to weaponize rhetoric on ethnic lines, for instance. You allow people to flame up tensions, and that is where you devolve into political chaos, because there's no objective metric as to who is the leader we should have. Finally then, they bring to you a little bit of positive material surrounding how political parties can piggyback off the image of this leader. I'll engage with this. I like to note that your legacy will die over time, like what we're seeing now. So if in the past, even in the short term, Lee Kuan Yew was able, and the PAP was able to piggyback off of his actions, I think currently when we're seeing the Worker Party making great advances within the recent general elections in Singapore, clearly your legacy can only last you so long. At some point, you are forced to actually improve conditions on the ground if you want to continue to stay in power. With that being said, I have 2 arguments in my speech. Number 1, on how the glorification of benevolent leaders was necessary for the stability of the country, and 2, how this spearheaded development in Asian countries the most. On to the first argument, 3 layers here. 1, note that a majority of Asian countries back then and now are still nascent democracies. So at the point where you first got out of colonization, the law had many exposed loopholes which were vulnerable to exploitation. Note that most of the population was disenfranchised as a result of colonization, so we needed opportunities created to enfranchise themselves. Exploitation was stopped by these very benevolent strongman leaders like Lee Kuan Yew, who from the moment where he got into power, he did things like introduce public housing, because he needed Singapore's population to be built from a bottom-up approach if we wanted a functioning political system. Secondly then, why do we say the best option available is to glorify the strongman leader? Because note that the strongman leader oftentimes was the face of the movement for independence. So they already had public support behind them. And in the face of post-colonization, you needed to glorify a familiar face so that people could rally behind. I posit to you that absent of glorification, people don't agree as to who should rightfully assume power. And that's when you have things like political infighting, when you have such open criticism. I think that is when you have coups, when people are unsatisfied. Finally then, the comparative. Why absent of glorification, you don't get unified support under one leader? Because of things like colonization, racial tensions existed because of divide and conquer policies. But strongman leaders helped to resolve this by unifying different people under the banner of nationalism. I say absent of colonialism, they created power vacuums that would devolve into ethnic conflict, because when you don't have a glorified leader, it means there isn't a single leader to look up to. This is important because when you want to create a stable state, it needs to be built upon people agreeing as to who is the kind of leader you elect. Otherwise, you're merely going to devolve into prolonged civil war. We don't think that is good. Before I move on to the second argument, is there a point?
Can you actually engage with the fact that in status quo, many benevolent strongman leaders are the ones creating divisive ethnic lines when they focus on the ethnic majority and ignore everybody else who falls between the cracks, right?
No. We think now you're just trying to strawman our definition. If you're literally a benevolent leader, you need to have your people's best interests at heart. If you want political stability and to ensure your country can function perfectly fine, you need to include all the ethnicities. So sure, maybe Singapore is 75% Chinese, but Lee Kuan Yew also focused on the Malays and Indians because he realized that it was necessary to include all ethnicities if he wanted Singapore to be built prosper. Onto the second argument on how benevolent strongman leaders were the only individuals who spearheaded development within these countries. 3 layers. 1, glorification enabled the congregation of support under them. So when you have faith in a leader, that's when you have support for their policies, and that is where you're able to get critical mass and the buy-in to actually have those policies work. Because if it doesn't matter if you want to have things like public education and healthcare, if the people don't feel faith in the success of it, it won't work to begin with. Secondly then, why do you think the most sound policies are passed because of benevolence? Glorification of benevolence means that the leaders genuinely care about the welfare of the people. So Lee Kuan Yew created departments full of technocrats because he knew that these were the best people to formulate policies. And when you sustain efforts in long-term endeavors like education and healthcare, that is literally why Singapore has one of the best levels of education and healthcare in the world. It's because of the groundwork that Lee Kuan Yew laid out. Finally then, I think you ensure the continuation of the state, because if you want a legacy, you're going to ensure that you have a successor who can carry on your role. This is important because we don't need a constantly changing political climate. We don't need constant political dissidents like running things like mudslinging campaigns. If you truly wanted success for a nation that just emerged from a post-colonial state, then it's only under the helm of a strong and benevolent leader where this was ever possible. So proud to oppose.
Thank you. Inviting DPM.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yep, both.
Okay, I would like my POIs in chat, please. Okay. There's a reason why they only use Singapore as an example. It's because this hasn't worked literally anywhere else. But also, Singapore is a terrible example to use because we are a one-party state. I would know that because I'm Singaporean. First thing I want to talk about is how this delayed democracy in the past. Anya told you that glorification resulted in leaders being seen as necessary for development, and it tied the individual leaders to nationalism and national identity, such as being seen as the father of independence or the father of the country. This created a cult of personality that made it unacceptable to criticize the leader, restricted information about their policies, and caused the public to be blinded by adoration for them so they could not critically assess their policies. Because they had so much control over the institutions, over the parliament, over the laws, over the judges, over the military, they didn't have to please the public. They didn't have to make people happy because it never mattered whether people are happy or not, they would have remained in power. This was bad for democracy because it resulted in poor economic policy. Things like not being able to criticize Ne Win's Burmese socialist policies that resulted in poverty and famine. Things like the rigging of elections under Sukarno, where voter access was restricted, votes were rigged, and Sukarno himself directly appointed members of the cabinet so that the parliament would be full of his cronies. The point to make here is that these politicians had unilateral power and that there were no check and balances. To all of these historical things that we have observed, to all of these things in history that we can point towards where these leaders have abused their power, the opposition says, but they were benevolent. Benevolent means they care about these people. My response is benevolent is in inverted commas. If we look at history, these people did not have the interest of people at heart. And all of this was hidden or tolerated because of glorification. The voting, the rigging of the votes, the suspension of elections, all of this was seen as necessary for development, and so people accepted it blindly. But even if it was not poor economic policy or the rigging of elections that destroyed democracy, it was literal martial law. It allowed for democracy to be suspended, which meant that these countries had decades of no democratic freedom or civil liberties. It eroded democratic institutions, it rewrote constitutions, and we are still recovering from the effects of this today. This is not just debate analysis, this is literally history. Look at Sukarno's guided democracy in 1960 or Marcos' period of martial law in 1970. Those were not good for the country. You can say that they were benevolent, but if you ask the people living in the 1960s in Indonesia or the people living under Marcos' martial law in 1970 and ask them whether they think these people were benevolent, they would say no if they were still alive. Did unification happen? No. Sulet told you in a POI that these strong men belonged to one ethnic group. They were not politicians, they were nationalists. They enforced their ethnic identity onto the nation state because they never had to play the game of politics. Their power was already assured because they had unilateral power and control over institutions. This looks like Sukarno supporting Javanese cultural norms and excluding those in the outer islands like Kalimantan. This looks like Marco only benefiting the Luzon elite and excluding Muslims in Mindanao. When they say that unification happened in the post-colonial period in Southeast Asia, I question them as to when. In the Dawu Islam Uprising in Indonesia, in the Moro National Liberation Front in Philippines, in the Patani Muslim United Liberation Organization in Thailand, and in the Kayin Burma uprising that's still happening to today, when has unification ever happened? Because of this leader, it has never happened. Because unification happened on the terms and conditions decided by the ethnic majority. The Luzon elite in Philippines, the Javanese in Indonesia, the Siamese Thai in Thailand, unification was never inclusive like they seemed to think. They then said, what would happen in the counterfactual? Because the counterfactual would have been absolute chaos. Here is the counterfactual. We think that there would be democratic institutions, and there are historical reasons for this. The 1945 White Paper and the Aung San Adli Agreement in Burma, the Jones Act in the Philippines, or the Constitution written by the British for Singapore. These were constitutions and democratic institutions that existed in these countries pre-existing the strongman leaders. All of these things that protected our civil liberties, that protected our democratic rights, were eroded away by these strongman leaders. When Sukarno said he would bury all parties leading up to that guided democracy, when Marco literally rewrote the constitution, those were the erosions of our democratic freedom that we might have enjoyed back then, but people did not get a chance to. They said that we needed people to get involved and we needed this cult of personality for people to want democracy. But this was never the case. Leaving the period of colonization, people desperately wanted independence and self-determination. Look at how the Indonesians desperately fought the Dutch in order to get independence. Look at how the Burmese desperately asserted themselves against the British. People wanted independence, people wanted democracy. There was already this cultural norm or social norm for these things. We never needed these strongman leaders to get people to vote. Minorities on our side will have had democratic representation because, one, the democratic institutions and protections will have still existed, but two, politicians will actually have to lobby for their votes instead of being assured a seat in parliament because they literally control the elections. But secondly, the identity that exists in modern Southeast Asia today is based not on being like from Indonesia or from Philippines or from Singapore. It was based on the identity asserted by these strongman leaders that existed today. This is why Chinese privilege existed in Singapore. In the counterfactual, where we did not have this person elevated to a godlike status, the basis of identity would have been made to include more people. This looks like talking about shared experience of colonization. This looks at being as one people because you inhabit the same national borders. Those were all the other avenues for national identity to be created. None of these things happened because they were robbed of it because of the strongman leaders. How does this affect us now? The first, erosion of democratic institutions meant that it became easier for future authoritarian leaders to rise to power. Second, opposition parties never had the opportunity to build public presence and political capital. The Workers' Party isn't winning in Singapore. Third, authoritarian leaders and authoritarianism has become embedded in their cultural DNA. We are now more tolerant of restrictions of civil liberties because we have less democratic consciousness, because it was taken away from us for decades. This is why it's so hard for us to push for progressive change in modern Asia today. The ghosts of these strongmen still haunt us today, but we think that all progress has to come because we need to trade off our civil liberties. This has normalized the trade-off in Asia, where we continue to make trade-offs to our civil liberties because we were lied to that this is the only way to achieve progress. Why is authoritarianism bad? Even if it was necessary back then, it hurts us now. They needed to weigh this because we have countries never emerging from democracies. Look at Burma. They said legacies will eventually die. Look, the Workers' Party has 3 constituencies out of 31 in Singapore. Bongbong in the Philippines is a candidate that is rising to power in the 2022 elections. Their legacy clearly hasn't died yet. Look at all the cases where people are still glorifying this leader even today. But just a very simple principle. Governments have immense power to control us, to control the social norms, to throw us in jail. And therefore, given that they have so much power, we needed to consent in order for them to have a mandate. This is why we needed to vote even back then, because it's not enough to say they were benevolent, they will make good decisions. We actually had to consent to them.
Thank you, DPM. Inviting DLO.
Oh God, okay, I was unmuted. Muted. Hi, can I be heard? Sorry.
Yeah, you can.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think think we have to concede that nobody thought Sukarno was a benevolent leader because there can be strongman leaders on both sides of the house. There will be oppressive dictators, but this debate is not about them because not only can we do nothing about it, government side can do nothing about it either. Do you think on government, if you said to your oppressive leader, dictators, tell them, hey, I'm questioning your leadership, do you think they would suddenly give you democracy? Do you think that if you stop saying that they were proper leaders, that they would stop imposing martial law onto your people? That isn't going to happen on either side of the house. This debate is about people who actually cared about their individuals on the ground, and this is how we protect them under our side of the house. Two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about accountability and outcomes for the people, and secondly, I'm going to talk about unity. Firstly, then, let's talk about accountability. Before that, I would like to know what proposition is actually pushing to us in terms of the counterfactual. Because if we're defining a world where they want proper criticism of their leaders, they want a proper democracy, for example, we would like to note that even in the most developed democracies in the world, there is no proper objective criticism. If they can't even master objective criticism, how do you think that a nascent democracy that most Asian nations are, if they concede the context of post-colonialism, how do you think these nations are going to objectively criticize the policies of the leaders? What we think is more likely to happen is a few things, right? Number one, it looks like political mudslinging. It looks like racially motivated attacks against their leaders, especially given the multiracial context of these Asian nations. Secondly, it looks like selfishness leading to political misinformation. It leads to things like populism rising, people only caring about themselves and their own racial groups, given that there is no longer a benevolent leader to unify everybody under the flag of, for example, this is our nation and I'm going to be a benevolent leader to help everybody. Government tries to say that democracy is important, that you need to have a say in your policies, but we would posit to you that in a failing democracy, you have no say in the policies when the democratic system is already failing you. All you can have on your side of the house when that is the situation, we think all you can have is good outcomes, and only we are able to ensure those good outcomes. They can talk all they want about having to choose your leaders, choose the policies, but they don't tell us the importance of that choice, especially since that choice isn't even valid when misinformation is rampant, especially since on our side of the house, we give you money, we give you welfare, and that actually empowers even more choices when you're allowed to, for example, buy things that make you happy, enjoy a better quality of life, get good education, and etc. All of these things we are able to guarantee government still hasn't engaged with yet. Let's talk about accountability then in a few ways. Number one, let's talk about the definition of what this leader actually is, because I can't believe we still have to clarify what the definition of benevolence is. It means they want to help people and means they're able to recognize that they're imperfect. If they are power hungry, if they're only in power just to impose martial law so that they can stay in power and maintain influence, that is literally not the definition of benevolence, right? They can say benevolence in quotation marks as much as they like. That is not a substitute for a rebuttal to literally the definition of what benevolence is. This means that when they make mistakes, they will want to hear people out, they will want to correct themselves. They pride themselves, these benevolent leaders pride themselves on being good people. That's why Lee Kuan Yew explicitly said, I don't want people to support me as a cult of personality. I just want to be a good leader. I just want to help people, because they like that as part of their identity, right? So even if their errors are overlooked over time, this is taking prime minister at their best, right? At the very least, they will figure out their mistakes, they will recognize them, and even if we cannot criticize them, at least they will correct for it, and therefore we will still have good outcomes. So if we have good outcomes, looking like good welfare for people, equal housing and public services, unclear as to why that is a benefit that government doesn't want to claim. But also, if your prime minister gives you welfare, gives you public schools and employment, we ask government, what is there to question anyway? Why do you want to question a perfectly functioning system when you can just let it be and not allow selfish political parties to take advantage of the instability to solidify their rule through populism instead? And here's where they want examples. We can give them examples, right? Government listing the list of examples that aren't even relevant to this debate doesn't substitute for analysis. This is like Turkey's Ataturk, right? It looks like Brunei's king. All of these individuals able to help the people on the ground that government still cannot claim. Secondly, what is the accountability mechanism then on government? If we take them at their best and we want people to question the democratic system, what do they rely on? Because they rely on bureaucratic, ineffective, and corrupt systems to regulate the actions of these political actors. Why does this fail in two ways? Number one, can government actually even question their people in power? We don't think so, right? Because if they talk about putting people in jail for questioning the political parties, that is a sedition law that will exist on their side anyway, right? So if you question your abusive authoritarian leader, obviously they're still going to kill you anyway, right? The difference is on our side of the house. A benevolent leader can probably say that, sedition laws are undemocratic, and they potentially think that we want freedom of speech. They could potentially remove sedition laws. On government, if they're so selfish and they take advantage of political instability, they in fact have a lesser ability to question these leaders. But secondly, notice that questioning your leaders doesn't equate to accountability, right? We can question our Malaysian government as being corrupt, but clearly nobody has been prosecuted. You can bribe judges, you can can just pay bail and etc. Like, there's no proper way to ensure accountability. And on their side of the house, accountability comes only after the mistake has already been made, after they've already made racially motivated policies. On our side of the house, we already have good policies and equal policies to begin with. We don't need the accountability mechanisms anyway. But lastly, we think that the next leaders for the country are going to be better. So we have long-term accountability actually. They set a higher standard because as governments claims, Singapore really isn't the standard, right? Because it's a one-party system. But if it's a proper political system with new successors and etc., people are not irrational. They're able to compare their current leader to their past one. So if you're unable to live up to the high standard that the previous leader has already set, they're likely to oust you. It looks like Malaysia being able to oust their leaders after decades because we glorify them only because of their good traits. We glorify them as good leaders who helped us, not as a Chinese person who is somehow leading the country. So that is how we're able to hold them accountable. Before I go on, I'll take that point. I'll take a point.
You claim that somehow this idea that they're going to be able to have better leaders in the future because they'll hold them to the standard. That's not really the way it works, right? They expect people of the same race, of the same educational background, and unless these new leaders meet the same standard, they're not valid leaders.
Okay, yeah, I don't know when you read about Singaporean history that people glorified Lee Kuan Yew for being Chinese and a man, but they glorified him for helping the country. So it doesn't matter what race he is, as long as he helped the country, they're living up to the traits of Lee Kuan Yew. But also notice that this is our best case, right? The future is our best case. You still haven't defended your current situation, your status quo. If this is a regrets debate, how are you even going to get the country started off to begin with? And here's where I'm going to talk about unity, right? Because it's merely asserted by the government side that we isolate minorities. That's not true for two reasons. Number one, definitionally, a benevolent leader isn't racist. But secondly, if they are not unifying at all, they will be controversial leaders, not universally beloved individuals. So government has to recognize their counterfactual. Looks like populism, looks like selfishness, right? Because if you allow the instability of a post-colonial society take over, that is what they get. They don't get the shared experiences of colonization, when colonization literally resulted in the divide and conquer of races, causing racial tensions between different racial lines, right? So there is no unity on their side of the house. You need a strong leader to unite everybody under the banner, and they need to be strong. They need high amounts of devotion toward them in order for this overwhelming devotion to succeed. That is the only way we're able to ensure a growing democracy proud to.
Thank you, DLO. Inviting Golf Whip.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, give me a few seconds. Panel, a benevolent leader, no matter how good their intentions are and interests are to benefit people, have harmed the development of democracy and social progress. And we think that's just what status quo looks like. This is not something that opposition can run away with. I don't doubt that Lee Kuan Yew had the best interests of Singapore in mind, but the racial minorities in Singapore, after decades of its political stronghold and PAP's one-party system and cult of personality, right, has hindered the discourse and the critique of his leadership in fear of being seen as ungrateful and entitled. I don't know what kind of world the opposition lives in when they're not willing to make this acceptance that this is what reality and status quo has looked like. Our counterfactual. I think we've been very clear from the first to second speaker that this just looks like we are in support of proper criticism and objective critique of leaders, right? We're okay to make the trade-off that yes, there's probably going to be an increased amount of discourse, there's probably going to be a rise of backlash. We're even okay with saying that even if people are able to objectively critique their leaders, right? That there's gridlock in parliament or whatever, because people are actually questioning their actions, questioning the kind of policies that they're making, and not accepting them as some godlike leader who can make no mistakes ever, right? We don't actually have to defend that we regret everything that these leaders have done or that they've actually had a bad political system or have done harm to these countries, right? What we regret is the glorification and the godlike status and the artificial glorification that these leaders are the fathers of the nation, that these leaders are the only one who brought these nations to where they are and are solely responsible for the success that these nations often face today. We think that's not, we think that it's harmful that this glorification has led to them having a form of cult of personality around them and being glorified as the god of the nation itself. Okay, a few rebuttals before I go into clashes. Firstly, they talk about how the definition of benevolence, right? They say that, okay, this debate is about leaders who actually cared about individuals on the ground, right? I think we have a few responses. I'll talk about it later in my speech as well. But benevolence is precisely why these leaders are so dangerous, right? I think most leaders in general, or most people in general, think that they act in the best interest of these nations. But the problem comes in when these benevolent leaders, who often do benefit the majority of the country, who do benefit the ethnic majority, who do benefit the racial majority, seems like they're actually doing a good job, or seems like they're actually benevolent leaders simply because they've benefited the majority, right? But often the people who fall between the cracks, the people who are in ethnic minorities, the people who are forgotten by policies and are neglected simply because they don't fit into the majority criteria, simply because they don't fit into what we understand as the majority of the public, are going to be hurt the most, right? And this is precisely what like both Anya and Cavan talked about. But secondly, they want to talk about accountability, right? First of all, I'm really not sure how accountability actually happens in opposition when these leaders are the ones who are in power for long periods of time, right? It's not like a 4-year ruling, right? It's often that these leaders often become entrenched in these political systems, that their political parties become the default, the incumbent state, right? These are the leaders who have the cult of personality formed around them. And it's much easier for them to just say, yeah, I kind of screwed up, I apologize, sorry. That's easy for them to say, but it doesn't actually fix all of the things that they do. And even after they have taken accountability for their actions, people often forget about this, right? They want to talk as much good as like Lee Kuan Yew as possible, but yeah, everybody forgets that he was like eugenist, he like said some pretty problematic shit that no one wants to talk about, because if you say bad things against Lee Kuan Yew, it makes it seem like you're an ungrateful, entitled bitch who doesn't actually care about your country, who is a treasonous person who hates the country, and you are unnationalistic and unpatriotic as hell, right? But second of all, even if accountability does happen on their side, we think it's a bad thing that democracy has been delayed for far too long, right? Yes, these democracies, that these leaders will correct their actions and somehow good things will happen, right? But at the same time, we think it's a much like slower progression of how democracy works, right? Because once you're in acceptance of status quo, and once you think that, oh yeah, this is how things should be, this is how leadership should be and what democracy would look like, you'll be very happy with status quo and you're not willing to move forward. This looks like Singapore being a very good example, where everyone's willing to make the trade-off that like Lee Kuan Yew and like Singapore is doing well, and therefore a lot of social conservatives still exist, and there's no like social progress, and no like social progress onto policies that actually affect like people and minorities, right? But lastly, people are actually not going to be happy at all, right? Like the response that they give to Anya was that, oh yeah, like people didn't see Lee Kuan Yew as some kind of like Chinese man, and that's why it's a good thing. Sorry, I only use Lee Kuan Yew as an example because I'm not like, I don't know a lot of other examples, but I think Lee Kuan Yew is a very good example in this debate, right? Because it's not that people see him as a Chinese man who like helped the country. It just seems like he's the father of the nation, who's the god of the nation, who actually helped build the country and the majority of the people. So like you don't really think about the ethnic minorities because that's not what you see, right? What you see is that the ethnic majority and the racial majority and the people who have benefited the most are the ones who are doing extremely well today, whereas everybody else who falls between the cracks are just left behind. Clashes. Firstly, what glorification looks like and what it does. Secondly, like what exactly these benevolent strongman leaders actually do. But most importantly, the first clash, right? I think we give you like multiple reasons why this is extremely harmful, right? We talked about what this glorification looks like. Firstly, the downplaying and hiding the mistake that leaders often made, that is often buried and forgotten from textbooks or like history curriculums that we talk about, right? This is something that they didn't want to engage with, and they just wanted to push the fact that benevolent means that they have the best interests, right? But secondly, I think precisely because of this benevolent like ideal, right? It was the propaganda machine that framed these leaders as those who knew all, those who knew what to do. And this is why all of these nonsense and the things that they do actually get swept up and forgotten, right? We're okay with this is why people are okay with making the trade-off that, yeah, this leader was so good that we're okay to not have these things, right? For example, like the LGBTQ community in Singapore, or like social progress or social democracy and things that people could move forward, but they don't because we've accepted the status quo. But lastly, I think that there's very little critique and discourse on the mistakes that these leaders made because of the characterization that both Anya and Cavan brought to you, right? That it seems like you're being a treasonous person who actually hate your nation. It's not you having discourse against the leader itself. It's like you critiquing the entire nation and making it seem like you are unnationalistic and unpatriotic. Before I go on, I'll take a POI. Oh, sorry, overtime. Sorry. Second of all, institutional empowerment and delayed democracy, which they kind of like never really responded to, right? They said that, oh yeah, leaders must eventually evolve and they will do good things or people will vote them out, right? Again, responded to when their power has been rooted so long, not just institutionally, but also just like in people's like like hearts, right? It's just unquestionable for them to be voted out. This is precisely why one-party states exist, right? When they talk about like the Workers' Party having much more like advancement and progress in society, they still have a very small minority of parliament and they still aren't able to make a lot of changes, right? When you see the next leader, you're always going to compare it and use this glorified leader as your frame of reference. No one is ever going to be good enough for you unless they come from their political party, unless they are like somehow related or like a successor of that party, right? So for all these reasons, I think what their side caused is a hurt to democracy and a hurt to all the people that these benevolent leaders are going to eventually ignore. Side with proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Golf Whip. Inviting Op Whip.
All right, am I audible?
Yep.
All right. I'll take POIs in chat. 3, 2, 1. It isn't sufficient for DPM to give a grocery list of bad things done by bad politicians, because that could never be a substitute for the actual analysis needed to prove why the counterfactual was going to be better. If you did not glorify them, how were they going to be portrayed? Because they could not fiat one that was going to be objective criticism, because people did not have the necessary information to do this. But if they wanted to argue Sukarno as their example, they can be my guest, because there's no way the context of a known to be oppressive leader fits within the characterization of benevolent leaders. Their only response was that they are only benevolent towards their own ethnicity and they don't care about anyone else. But note the benevolent leaders that we characterize from first, for national identities, they are exclusive, preaching values such as equality, such as diversity. And the reason we know this to be true is that it is a retrospective motion, and these leaders have been able to be successful in their policy. That's why we glorify them today still. That's how we've been able to see these countries develop. They have to engage in a reasonable middle ground. They cannot win a debate and assume the tipping point was just on these some instances of some dictators imposing this martial law in those countries. 3 crucial clarifications. The first was about the counterfactual of them, because note they could not fiat what a dominant narrative would be in the absence of this. We explained why you don't have these leaders coming into power. This was harmful because their side also has these same leaders in power, because it wasn't the glorification that led them to being in power. It was them being in power first before the glorification happened, which means if these people were such benevolent people they wanted to talk about, presumably most of the stuff they done would have been symmetrical per their own analysis. So even if you believe them, they kind of incur all their own harms. But what the more charitable context was that if these leaders did also exist on their side, it was that you're no longer able to hold them up to the same standards because they weren't glorified for their good values in that regard. But the second thing here is that our burden was never to prove that these were perfect leaders. Note that their continuous burden push, that we had to push that these leaders, we have to show the bad things that these leaders have done. But it's unclear why that's the case. Like presumably no leader is perfect. They had to tell us why their leaders were going to be comparatively better. Otherwise, they would have the same leaders as well. But third, democracy isn't necessarily independent, because the meta loading from DPM that people prefer democracy, and that will be the counterfactual, was a lie, because you can expel the British from your territory, but you can still choose to maintain a national monarchy. You can still choose to maintain a national, somewhat autocratic government. So it doesn't prove why people have an express preference for democracy, which means there's no mechanism for how they achieve their counterfactual. They have no case then. 3 issues. First, on the accountability of leaders and the subsequent governments. But note that since this was a historical and retrospective motion, their burden was to explain if you didn't get unity back then, would the country even be able to survive and develop up to today? Because note, these were historically nascent governments, so post-conflict Asian state governments. So some things are outside the control of this narrative, meaning that after like you come out from a post-conflict condition, most of the time you're probably going to have large degrees of instability. They don't prove how you're able to get that then, because even if these leaders symmetrically get into power, you aren't able to cement the same amounts of national support for these people, which means these forms of instability are rife. You don't have the healing and unity that was necessary. But second thing here is that it's a fatal correlation from their end to say things like sedition was solely a direct result of the glorification of these leaders, because presumably even if you didn't have this leader, if the country was one that was going to be autocratic anyway, they would still have those same laws. But note the biggest problem with their case, and they pushed into all 3 speeches, which means that this is probably their largest argument. So if we take it down, then we're kind of good, which is that they say errors and mistakes they made in their time as a leader are ignored. But the first thing is that this is objectively untrue, because many years later, we are still able to critique them. But what's the crucial nuance here that wins us the debate? The crucial nuance here is that while they are developing, we think it's fair for to somewhat not show the bad things that this leader has done, but we don't think these are going to be significantly fatal, because these leaders don't do a lot of bad bad things anyways. This was completely unresponded to because it means in the long run, if the same policies from 50 years ago were somewhat bad, were not modern anymore, were not progressive, we were able to move past that because it was just like objectively, it's not logical to put those policies then here when the economy is modernizing. So we are able to critique them for those bad things 50 years in the future. But what we need now is unity because that's more important than anything else. But second, they can't fear that people are going to objectively criticize because note that if you allow the people in your political dissidents, you allow your opponents to just harp on every single mistake you do because they want to undermine your legitimacy. That creates massive amounts of instability because the counterfactual was if you don't have glorification, then any forms of criticism were those that were going to be toxic and you highlight further harms of the political scene within these countries. But second, they said benevolent leaders are not really like strongman leaders. So here's what we're going to take to the comparative then. Let's take them at their absolute best case, that these were in fact malicious leaders and they did do bad policies that prevented progress. We still think it's preferable for the reason that stability was better than constant volatility. When your ministers are changing all the time, you literally cannot have good policy that's going to set your country forward. If we believe their case and you allow you to depose of these leaders, it wasn't a vacuum of dictator bad, so government bench wins. It was contingent on proving the comparative after you depose these leaders was going to be good. Second, then on ensuring personal accountability. The first was that the identity, brand, and legacy of these leaders was that I was someone who was known for things like equality, which means that in the event that you are going to deviate from this and you make like anti-equality policies, people are able to criticize you for that because you're betraying their forms of glorification. Then that is why they won't defect to become bad people. That's why they won't become corrupted and won't let power go to their heads. But second, there's an emphasis of transparency. We explained from LO why they have incentive to do things like technocrats and consultants in governments because otherwise you just can't have a functioning state. There was no response from GovBench to this. But third, no, we're not letting you're not letting the political parties piggyback off this. Their only response was that the Workers' Party has 3 out of 31 constituencies. But note that like Pritam Singh has been able to call out like Edwin as well because people are able to know the current government isn't acting to the same standards like Lee Kuan Yew is, which means that we're able to compare them against a good leader. So current people have to have higher standards to live up to. We're able to critique them for that. If you don't have the glorification, they can do the absolute bare minimum and still be legitimized because you have nothing to compare them against. But third, here's about democracy and long-term change. First, on democracy, I don't know why it's an absolute good because countries have different political systems. You can't equally say democracy is good for all states. But second, I don't really explain why democracy was going to play out in a way that was good. So even if you believe the principle that it was good, what we explained was that you allow the majority to weaponize democracy in their favor. Because if you have weak systems of democracy, if you had weak democratic institutions, then you also allow the same harms of their side. You allow ethnic majorities to get into power and you don't let these people change. Because the comparative is at least benevolent dictators can still like do things based on what the consultants tell them because they're not objectively like contingent on what the voters want. But what happens on their side is you can only pivot to what the voters want. So you never care about the minority at all. We are better off because we care for everyone. In the worst case, where we have to regress away from democracy, that's fine in the short term because the long term is we build up those stable functions of our state. We're able to prevent the worst harms of a post-conflict instability because we allow everyone to unite under the umbrella of this is our newborn state. For all these reasons, we're incredibly proud to win this debate.
Thank you, Op Reply. Op inviting Op Reply.
Hi, I'm going to assume I can be heard. All right, starting my reply in 3, 2, 1. I think we just have to congratulate government today for repeating the words objective criticism for 3 speeches straight, but we still don't actually know what it means. We don't know what like their criticism looks like or what democracy looks like compared to what we've told you from opposition, how this critique is actually creating political instability, how this critique is necessarily mudslinging and won't actually be constructive. And we think since they haven't responded to it, this like characterization continues throughout this debate, and we think we're able to take it at the end of the day. 2 things then in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about welfare, and secondly, I'm going to talk about the long term of the country as well as democracy. Firstly then, about welfare, because we told you from the start of this debate, the most important thing to care about is the conditions of the people on the ground and whether or not they can be improved. In a post-colonial state we characterize to you with tensions that are rampant with people who are likely to be selfish, what you get on government is not actually a functioning democratic system. It's people taking advantage of the nascent democracy, taking advantage of the inability to hold people accountable, and taking advantage of tensions to solidify things like populism populism and racism among individuals on the ground. We told you about our policy from the start. We will get technocrats. We have census to survey the desires of different groups of individuals. And we told you that this is the only actor who is capable of uniting everybody because they're the only one that people believe will actually care for them. That is what you get in a benevolent leader that people believe in. No response from government. The only thing they ever told us was that what if they are bad? Well, what if they are bad doesn't cover it under this motion because the motion literally tells you they are good people. And we told you what a good person is likely to do when they are given these positions of powers. So sure, we don't guarantee that a good person is necessarily perfect, but we think it's still better than government because when they make mistakes, they will change. But even if they don't change, they have to recognize what world government is actually living in. We have healthcare, we have education, and we have people literally not starving. This is far more important than any criticism that government attempts to levy onto these political parties because we don't actually hear from them what the importance of this criticism is. If your life is already far better than anything government can afford to you, it's unclear as to what a talking head is going to do. You can say the government is terrible, but we don't even have a terrible government. So at the end of the day, we win this debate. If they want to say you have to criticize your government to have a good government, we already have a good leader. We can keep the good leader, you can keep your criticism. Secondly, then let's talk about long-term and democracy. So we don't actually know what their democracy looks like, right? Panel, you should take that as that lack of engagement as a concession that our definition of what their democracy looks like stands. It looks like a toxic democracy, one that's inherently unhealthy, full of misinformation, propaganda, things to dissuade voters, especially given as they concede it is a nascent democracy. No response as to how they have a healthy democracy. They cannot idealistically assert that it's going to be perfect, they're going to have perfect objective decisions, and they're going to have perfect voters as well. But also note that you are just a colonized nation. There are existing tensions, and it's highly difficult as to how your new democracy is going to be able to healthily adopt all of these new factors and somehow make sure there's objective decisions and also have good systems that help everybody. As we've already outlined to you, we think the decisions on their side of the house overwhelmingly favor the majority. It is minorities that get shut out in a democracy that is toxic. Only on our side of the house as a benevolent leader to supersede the kinds of toxic mentality of the majority are we able to fix this on our side of the house. But lastly, then let's talk about accountability, right? Because notice that the so-called harms of glorification they try to push to us are actually symmetrical. Sedition laws are the result of a UK common law system, not the glorification of these leaders. They don't fix it either, but it's even worse on their side of the house because all these harms of a failing legislative system cannot be fixed on their side of the house when the people in power only take advantage of these loopholes to keep themselves in power. Benevolent leaders as well set the groundwork for a transition into democracy. But notice this is our best case. So even if in the long term it is not a perfect democracy, it's still far better than people in the starting of a nation starving to begin with, right? So we have education systems that allow for more politically aware individuals to question their leaders in the future. We need a more stable government system first. We need someone to first witness what a good leader looks like before we can try and hope for good leaders in the future. Better than on government side of the house where they simply entrench populism and corruption, proud to oppose.
Thank you, Op Reply, for the speech. Inviting Go Reply.
Okay, can I check that I'm audible?
Yes.
Okay, just give me my timer. Okay. Okay. I just want everyone to cut us a bit of slack because this motion requires us to rewrite history and reimagine history. So obviously I cannot give you a 10-page essay on what these leaders would look like and how the political system would have looked like. But I think Anya and I gave you some possible reasons that are quite fair about what might happen in the world without glorification. So when we strip away their title as the father of independence and as the father of the nation, then possibly we'll be able to view them in a more objective light. But more crucially, we wouldn't justify a lot of their mistakes and a lot of their actions, right? It would be easier to hold them accountable and there'll be less centralized power in a world where we didn't think that they always make good decisions just because they are the father of the nation. They then said that on our side, we might have been stuck with authoritarianism. But this happened for sure on their side, right? They're saying it might have happened. We might have had democracy, we might have authoritarianism, we might have monarchy. I don't know, I'm not a historian, but democracy for sure was stamped out on their side, right? When Marco rewrote the constitution, when Lee Kuan Yew locked up opposition members, all those things definitely did happen. So democracy was 100% gone on their side, might have emerged on our side, I don't know. But we gave you some possible reasons for why it probably would have emerged, right? We told you that in the post-independent period, people wanted representation and self-determination. There was already a desire for democracy and representation and self-determination in such places. So possibly people would have wanted it. They then said democracy is not always good, but so is authoritarianism, right? Authoritarianism, we pointed out, resulted in poor economic policies, violence, and martial law. Democracy might not always be good. I'm not gonna be some Western liberal person oh yeah, democracy is always great. But At least we have check and balances, constitutions, and democratic protections to prevent it from getting too bad. In authoritarianism, there's no check and balances, so like it gets really bad really quickly. They said, but look at Singapore good. But then like every other Asian country, like maybe not the same as Singapore, so I'm not really sure. They then said countries can still escape authoritarianism. We gave you reasons why authoritarianism and the tolerance for it became embedded in history and culture. They said that this trade-off was justified because unification happened. We gave you a bunch of reasons why unification didn't even happen in the post-independence period. Look at all the civil uprisings that happened. I listed a bunch of examples in my speech. Would we have authoritarian leaders? No, because in the post-colonial period, Asian countries had a framework of democracy, which means there was check and balances and there were separations of power. These frameworks were eroded by the strongmen. Strongmen were voted in, then glorify, then use glorification to erode democratic institutions, then people don't care because they see them as God, right? Like, so what happened because of that? Like rigging elections, rewriting constitutions, directly appointing cabinet members, these were things that they used as a result of their glorification. They then said, oh, but democracy bad because like, wow, there'll be like misinformation, mudslinging, and then there'll be infighting. But this is a general argument against all forms of democracy, right? But like also, it's like a feature, not a flaw of democracy. The fact that there are disagreements is a good thing in a democracy because people are getting their voices heard. There's an exchange of ideas, there's social representation that happens. Yes, democracy is imperfect, there might be some stalling, but this is good because it's better than having a leader with unilateral power and control of all the institutions that can sometimes be used to benefit themselves. They said, but look, Singapore used power responsibly. The progress that we have now was paid with our civil liberties, right? It was paid in blood. But also, like they say Lee Kuan Yew, then we say Nevin, Marco, Sukarno, then I don't know how you want to weigh this. They then said benevolent means that they will always do good things. And this one line is really doing overtime for them, right? They're like, benevolent means that they will never do anything bad. They will never rig elections. They will never do anything undemocratic. We're going to be charitable here. We pointed out that even if they're benevolent, they are fallible. You can have good intentions, but still make mistakes. The second is that they're benevolent in a limited sense, meaning that they usually only support one ethnic group. But also, we give you a bunch of examples for when this benevolence has been misguided, like Lee Kuan Yew locking up opposition members, like Operation Coastal happened, guys. But also, we told you that it didn't matter, right? It didn't matter that they were good people because it was about democratic consent. That you cannot make a decision for someone and say it doesn't matter whether you choose or not because I know better than you. We've proven in a lot of those situations that they didn't know better. But also, in the majority of cases, they actually didn't know better. They made wrong decisions, and the state should never have the right to make such huge decisions over the lives of people without their democratic consent. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, glorification, for the speech, and thank you everyone for the excellent round. One thing I want to say is that it's actually Suharto, not Sukarno, but it's fine. Anyways, everyone can return and leave to the main room and wait for the simultaneous results announcement. Thank you and good luck to everyone. For my panelists, let's move to breakout room 10 to discuss. Yeah.
Thank you.